thought my boyfriend was just a deadbeat who sold my laptop to cover his debts. But when a group of armed men kicked down our garage door, I realized he was hiding a much deadlier secret inside his golf bag. I had two choices: become his accomplice or destroy him to save my own life. The betrayal didn't happen with a bang or even a shout. It happened in the quiet, sterile silence of a Tuesday afternoon while I was at the office, slogging through spreadsheets to pay the rent for an apartment we were supposed to be building a life in. I came home, dropped my bag, and walked toward the small nook in the living room where my workstation usually sat. I stopped. My breath hitched, a cold, sharp spike of anxiety driving into my chest. The mahogany desk was bare. No monitors, no docking station, no tangle of wires, and most importantly, no laptop. It was a high-end machine, the kind that cost more than my first car, but it wasn't just the monetary value that gutted me. It was the hard drive. Years of freelance projects, my finished manuscript, and the only digital copies of photos from my grandmother's final year were sitting on that machine. I checked the bedroom. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled out my phone, my thumbs trembling as I typed a message to Mark, my boyfriend of 3 years. "Where is my computer?" I sent it, then paced the length of the rug, my vision blurring with rage. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I heard the lock turn. Mark walked in, whistling, tossing his car keys into the bowl by the door. He looked relaxed, almost too relaxed, his face flushed with the kind of smug satisfaction I had grown to despise over the last few months. He didn't notice me standing in the shadows of the hallway until he turned toward the kitchen. He flinched, but the mask of indifference slipped back on instantly. "You're home early," he said, avoiding my eyes. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and leaned against the counter. "Where is it, Mark?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The laptop. The desk is empty." He took a long, slow sip of his drink, staring at the ceiling as if contemplating the weather. "Oh, that. Yeah, I had a bit of a situation. The credit card bill for the vacation came in, and I didn't want us to fall behind. I found a buyer. Quick cash, no questions asked." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You sold my work? My personal files? That wasn't yours to sell, Mark. That was mine." He shrugged, his expression hardening. "It's just a piece of tech, babe. Besides, we're a team, right? What's mine is yours, and what's yours is, well, it's keeping the lights on. Don't be dramatic." I stared at him, really stared at him, and realized for the first time that I didn't know the man standing in my kitchen. The "we" he kept preaching was just a thin veil for his own selfishness. He walked past me, heading for the bedroom, leaving me standing there with the metallic taste of betrayal heavy on my tongue. I watched his back, thinking of his prized possession, a set of custom-made, professional-grade golf clubs he'd spent half his savings on last winter. He treated those clubs like holy relics. He spent every Saturday on the course, ignoring my calls, ignoring our plans, ignoring everything that wasn't a fairway. I picked up my phone and searched for the local high-end sporting goods consignment shop, the one that dealt in discreet, quick sales. My hands stopped shaking. A cold, clear focus settled over me. If he could treat my life's work like a pawn shop commodity, then he wouldn't mind if I treated his hobbies the same way. I heard him humming in the bedroom, oblivious, as I walked toward the garage where he kept the golf bag locked in a specialized hard-shell travel case. I found the key on his keychain, which he'd left sitting on the entryway table. I gripped it so tight the metal bit into my palm. I wasn't just going to sell them. I was going to make sure he felt the exact same hollow, frantic panic I felt when I walked into this empty apartment. I reached the garage door and slid it open. The smell of oil and dust hit me, but my eyes locked onto the corner where the clubs were kept. I lunged for the bag, but as I grabbed the handle, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from my bank. A transfer had just cleared. He hadn't just sold my laptop. He had emptied our joint savings account, and the balance was sitting at 0. My heart stopped. I wasn't just broke. I was in debt. And as I stared at the screen, the garage door light flickered, and I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of Mark's boots stepping onto the concrete behind me. The sound of his boots on the concrete was measured, slow, and predatory. Each step echoed against the cinder block walls, punctuating the silence of the garage. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the zeros on my phone screen, the numbers blurring into a mocking parade of my own gullibility. I had been paying the rent, the utilities, and the insurance for months, thinking we were splitting the load, while he was draining the reserves I'd spent years building. "You're planning something," Mark said. His voice wasn't angry, it was patronizing, the tone of a man talking to a child who had tried to hide a broken vase. "I can see it in the way you're standing. You're stiff. You're angry." I finally turned, sliding my phone into my pocket with a fluid, hidden motion. The golf bag was right beside me, a heavy, leather-bound tomb of his obsession. I placed a hand firmly on the handle, not hiding my intent. "The savings, Mark?" I said, my voice eerily calm. "You didn't just sell the laptop. You took everything. That was for the house. That was for my master's degree." He took another step forward, his shadow stretching long and distorted under the flickering bulb. "It's called an investment. I put that money into a play, a tip I got at the club. By next week, that money will have doubled. You're welcome, by the way." "You don't get to gamble my future on a tip," I snapped, my hand tightening on the golf bag. "You don't get to gamble my life." He laughed, a sharp, barking sound that grated against my nerves. He took a final step, bringing him into the reach of the dim light. His eyes were cold, devoid of the charm he used to wear like a suit. He saw me gripping the golf bag, and his nostrils flared. "Don't touch that, Sarah," he warned, his voice dropping an octave. "You have no idea what those clubs are worth. You wouldn't know how to handle them, you wouldn't know who to talk to, and you certainly wouldn't be able to get even a fraction of what I paid for them. Put the handle down and walk back into the house. We're going to have a talk about your attitude." "My attitude?" I echoed, feeling a surge of adrenaline so potent it made my fingers tingle. "You stole my livelihood and my security, and you're worried about the resale value of a few sticks?" I didn't wait for him to grab me. I swung the bag toward the garage door, my intention clear. I was going to throw this entire life into the street if I had to. But Mark was faster than I remembered. He lunged, his hand slamming onto the top of the bag, pinning it to the workbench with a force that made the metal table rattle. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine, the smell of cheap beer and expensive cologne suffocating me. "I said, walk away," he hissed, his fingers digging into the leather of the bag. "I'm in a hole, Sarah, a deep one, and if you think you're going to salvage your little feelings by destroying my only way out, you've got another thing coming." I stared into his eyes, looking for a flicker of the man I once loved. But there was nothing there, just a desperate, hollow greed. I realized then that he wasn't just a partner who had made a mistake. He was a man who had already calculated the cost of losing me and decided it was a price he was willing to pay. I leaned into him, matching his intensity. "If you're in a hole, Mark, then maybe it's time you learned how it feels to have someone fill it in while you're still standing at the bottom." I reached into my pocket, but I wasn't grabbing my phone this time. I pulled out the small, jagged utility knife I kept on my keychain, the one I used to open boxes from the office, and without breaking eye contact, I pressed the cold tip of the blade directly against the soft, expensive leather of the golf bag's primary compartment. Mark went deathly still. His hand stayed on the bag, his knuckles white. He looked down at the blade, then back up at me, his arrogance wavering for a fraction of a second. You wouldn't, he whispered. Try me, I said, my hand steady. One move toward me, and these go from professional grade to scrap metal. Just as I felt the tension reach a breaking point, the silence of the garage was shattered by the harsh, insistent ringing of his phone. He didn't look at it, but the caller ID illuminated his face in a ghostly blue light. His expression shifted from aggression to pure, unadulterated terror. He glanced at the screen, and the color vanished from his cheeks so rapidly, he looked like he was about to faint. He dropped his hand from the bag, backing away as if the phone were a coiled viper, leaving me standing there with the blade poised over his life's work. I can't answer that, he muttered, his voice trembling. Oh God, I can't answer that. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, and for the first time, I realized the tip he had taken wasn't just a bad investment. It was something far more dangerous, and whoever was calling him wasn't interested in money. Before I could even ask what was happening, the garage door began to rattle violently from the outside, as if someone, or several someones, were trying to kick it down. The metal garage door groaned under the impact, a booming, rhythmic assault that shook the shelves and sent a canister of motor oil tumbling to the concrete floor. Mark didn't even flinch at the noise. He was staring at his phone, which had stopped ringing and was now vibrating incessantly with incoming messages. The look on his face wasn't just fear. It was the look of a man who had finally realized the walls weren't just closing in. They were being demolished. "Who is that?" I screamed, the utility knife still gripped in my hand. Mark scrambled back toward the wall, his bravado replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. "You don't understand, Sarah. It wasn't just an investment. I borrowed money. I thought I could flip it and pay them back before anyone noticed. But the market crashed, and the interest, they don't do interest, they do penalties." The garage door buckled inward again, the metal twisting like foil. Someone outside wasn't just kicking, they were using a tool, a pry bar or a crowbar, methodically dismantling the structural integrity of our home. "Open the door, Mark!" a muffled, gravelly voice barked from the other side. "We know you're in there. We saw the car." I looked at the golf clubs, then at the garage door, then at the man I had lived with for 3 years. He had put a target on our backs. He had traded my peace, my hard-earned savings, and my digital life for a gamble that had brought professional debt collectors, or worse, to our doorstep. My rage shifted. It wasn't about the laptop anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was about the fact that my life was being held hostage by his cowardice. "Is that for you?" I demanded, gesturing toward the door. "They're going to kill me," he whispered, sliding down the wall until he hit the floor, his knees drawn up to his chest. "They don't care about the money anymore. They want an example." I looked at the golf clubs again. A sudden, jagged idea clawed its way into my mind. I didn't care about the clubs. I cared about the keys to the SUV sitting on the workbench right next to him. If I could get to that car, I could get to the documents I'd hidden in the glove box, the proof of his identity theft, the receipts, the evidence that could save me if the police ever got involved. "Get up," I hissed, grabbing his shirt collar and hauling him to his feet. "What are you doing?" he stammered. "Saving myself," I said. "If they want you, let them have you. But you're not taking me down with you." I shoved him toward the interior door leading into the kitchen, but he dug his heels in. "We can't leave. They'll be waiting in the front." I looked around the dim garage. There was a side window, small and high, but it led into the neighbor's overgrown hedge. It was our only shot. I grabbed the golf bag, slinging the heavy strap over my shoulder. "What are you doing with those?" Mark shrieked, his voice cracking. "Are you selling them now? You're insane!" "No," I said, a cold, hard smile touching my lips. "I'm using them as a distraction." I sprinted toward the side window, bracing myself to smash it. Suddenly, the garage door gave way with a screech of tortured metal. It didn't just bend. The entire frame tore from the drywall, and the heavy door slammed to the ground with a force that vibrated through the foundation. Light from the street lamp spilled into the garage, casting long, menacing silhouettes across the floor. Two men stood in the opening, dressed in dark jackets, their faces obscured by the harsh, flat glare of the streetlights. They weren't holding baseball bats or crowbars. They were holding something much smaller, much darker, and far more lethal. Mark let out a strangled sob, collapsing again. "Please," he begged, not to me, but to the shadows in the doorway. The taller man stepped inside, his eyes locking onto me, then moving to the golf bag slung over my shoulder. He didn't look at Mark, he looked at the clubs. "You," the man said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "You're the one who thought you could hide the collateral." I froze, my heart plummeting. I realized then that the laptop wasn't the only thing he'd been selling to pay these people. He hadn't just sold my computer. He'd used it as a lure to pay off his own debts, promising something that wasn't his to give. My breath hitched as the man took a step toward me, his hand reaching into his jacket. Behind him, the sound of a heavy sedan engine rumbled to life, blocking the driveway. There was no way out. The man smiled, a thin, cruel line, and pulled a set of keys from his pocket. Not for the SUV, but for the golf bag. He tossed them toward me, and they landed with a heavy, metallic clink at my feet. "Open it," he commanded. "We need to see if the chips are still inside the driver." The sound of the keys hitting the concrete was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but the cold clarity of survival had completely overtaken my fear. Chips? Hidden inside the clubs? The betrayal was deeper and far more sinister than I had ever imagined. Mark hadn't just been gambling with money. He had been a courier, using his obsession as a transport system for someone else's illegal trade. I looked down at the keys, then at the men, and finally at Mark, who was weeping openly now, his face pressed against the cold floor. He had put me in the middle of a war zone for the sake of his own skin. "Open it," the man repeated, his voice dropping into a register of quiet violence. He gestured with his weapon toward the bag. I knelt, my movements mechanical. I slid the key into the lock of the heavy, hard-shell travel case. With a soft click, the latches popped open. I didn't reach for the clubs. Instead, I grabbed the entire bag by the strap, and with a scream of adrenaline, I swung the heavy, unwieldy mass with every ounce of strength I possessed. It wasn't aimed at the men. It was aimed at the industrial shelving unit behind them. The bag crashed into the racks, sending them toppling over like a house of cards. Motor oil, boxes of old car parts, and heavy tools rained down on the two men, creating a chaotic, slippery avalanche. In the confusion, I didn't wait. I lunged for the side door, shoulder charging it until the frame splintered, and sprinted into the neighbor's hedge, ignoring the sharp bite of the thorns against my skin. I didn't stop running until I hit the street 3 houses down. I pulled my phone out, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it, and dialed the one number I prayed would still be active. My brother. He was a tech analyst for the precinct. "Sarah, it's 3 a.m. What's going on?" "I need you to track my laptop," I gasped, pacing the sidewalk. "It's been stolen, but that's not the half of it. Mark, he's involved in something huge. There are men here, at the house. They're after something in his golf clubs. Please, just tell me you can see the device." "I can't see the laptop, Sarah, but I'm looking at your iCloud data," he said, his voice instantly sharpening. "Wait, why is your location history showing up in the middle of a high-security industrial park across town? And why is your laptop currently logged into a dark web financial server?" Everything clicked into place. The laptop hadn't been sold to a pawn shop. It had been used as a remote node. Mark had been using my high-end machine to move the money, and the men in our garage were just the muscle. the people who had realized the courier was a fraud and had come to collect the hardware. "Get out of there," my brother commanded, his voice urgent. "I'm calling it in. Stay where you are." I watched from the safety of the shadows as 2 squad cars tore down the street, their sirens wailing into the night. They swarmed the property, lights flashing blue and red against the suburban houses. I saw the men being led out in handcuffs, their faces twisted in fury. Then, I saw Mark. He was slumped in the back of a cruiser, looking small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. When the officer brought him past me, he stopped. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, the same look he'd used to manipulate me for years. "Sarah, please, tell them I was forced. Tell them I had no choice." I didn't say a word. I just looked at the officer and nodded toward the garage. "Check the golf clubs," I said, "and check his browser history. You'll find everything you need to keep him there for a very, very long time." As they drove him away, the silence finally returned to the street, but it was different now. It was the silence of a clean slate. I stood there as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in soft, forgiving colors. I had lost the laptop, the savings, and the illusion of a life I thought I wanted. But as I turned and walked away from the house, I realized I had regained the only thing that actually mattered: the ability to decide what happened next. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The case was closed, and for the first time in years, the future felt like my own.